welcome to Royals, Rebels, and Romantics summer specials in August. Can't believe it's already August, and I am delighted to say that this month sort of is a home-based episode. We have our own creative director, Lindsey Lindstrom, joining me for a couple of episodes. First, we're going to talk about what goes on behind the scenes writing a history book, some of the research I have been able to do, the wonderful things I've seen and learned, and I'm really excited to share that with you. Then we'll be turning to some fun with fiction and looking at some of the murder mysteries that have tickled our fancy this summer. We're so excited you're joining us, so sit back and relax and enjoy summer specials with Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. We are continuing our summer specials, and this month we are going to look at books in a little different way. We've looked at some of our favorite authors, and now we're going to take a step back and consider what goes into writing a book before it hits your bookshelves and is in front of your eyeballs. So I have with me today our own Lindsey Lindstrom, our creative director, who's here to help me talk a little bit about the research that historians do, whether they're writing fiction or nonfiction, some of the places we do research, some of the ways, and some of the special things that I have found. So welcome, Lindsey. Thank you for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, great. And thank you for joining us just to talk a little bit about research and how that happens and where and when and why and everything. So, what should we know about research?
Well, I know that over the last several years, as you've been researching and getting ready for the books that you've been writing, that you have done research here in the United States, but you've also done a lot of research out of the United States in the UK. So where are some of the places that you've been finding to do this research?
Okay, great question. Thank you. So,
Yeah.
Lindsey used to be, and I still am, in the Washington, D.C. area. And one of the great things we have here, for one, if you're doing American research, would be the Library of Congress. But for English and British research, it is the Folger Shakespeare Library, which I love with all my heart. I have been a volunteer and a staff member at Folger. I am now a reader, a researcher at the Folger. And the Folger, in addition to having the most original copies of the first folio of Shakespeare's works, also has at least one copy of books printed in English during the early modern period. So it is a marvelous place. Unfortunately, and fortunately both, because it's now finished, the Folger has been undergoing a huge renovation to open more spaces to the public, to have more areas for researchers to get together and collaborate. And that physical renovation, which was interrupted by COVID, of course, as so many things were, is now complete. And so later, so this is a teaser, so you'll stick with us. Later, I do have a few images from the Folger, but that is a great place to research here in the US, especially on the East Coast where I am. But the other great place, of course, is to go right where these things happened. And I am excited to talk about some trips I have taken to the British Library in London and to the National Archives near London at Kew. And these are amazing institutions where anyone who is willing to, prove your identity and fill out some paperwork can get in and use parts of the collection and see some of these amazing, amazing pieces. So those are my favorite three places: the Folger, the Shakespeare Library, the British Library, and the National Archives.
Excellent. Well, that's good to know some of these amazing places you can look at these things. You kind of started to say that at the archives and at the British Library, anyone can do it as long as you prove your identity. So who can do research, and what does it take to be able to view the documents and things like that at those places?
So at the Folger, in all cases, you sort of need to submit in writing and fill out some forms, prove who you are. At the Folger, they
Right.
want to know what you're working on, which is true in most research libraries. They want to know what you're doing and why you need their collection. I
Okay.
was really excited to learn that at the British Library and the National Archives, even though I do not have a university affiliation, I am not a full-time professor anywhere, I am researching
Right.
on my own. But at both the British Library and the National Archives, I have been able to get a reader's card. And that has allowed me to have access to the collection, to see manuscripts as well as printed books, to have my hands on some things like a document signed by Henry VIII or Elizabeth I, to touch some of these seals that, they were in wax and they're now breaking down, and you can touch the pieces, of course, very carefully and under supervision. But
Right.
these are very much available to anyone who is really interested in seeing these documents. It's really fabulous that you can actually see them for yourself.
Yeah, that is kind of incredible. So you just mentioned like getting to touch seals and things, and that's pretty incredible. What are some of the other amazing things that you have seen as you've done your research in those places?
Well, I think the seals are really fun because you can imagine, you can see the smaller seals from the nobility about the size of a quarter or so, these
Yeah.
giant seals from the monarchs. And for so long, if you're looking back, and of course, the further back you go, the fewer survive, but you can definitely see there's a seal I saw of Henry V where you can see him on one side sitting on his throne, and then on the other side, he's on a horse with his sword up. And then when we get to Mary the First and Elizabeth I, suddenly monarchy isn't a man on a horse anymore. And so the seals change as well. And you do sometimes see Mary on a horse. It's not like she never was on a horse. And so she
Right.
does present herself as protecting England. And sometimes she is with Philip. But Elizabeth is often under a canopy of state on one side and just on her throne on the other. And so you see different ways that royalty represents themselves in these seals that would have gone with these documents. So that's just something interesting to see as times change. Um,
Yeah.
One of the things I was most excited to see, and I will say at the British Library, there are some objects that you have to, in addition to your reader's card, you have to have a letter of recommendation. And this was one of them that I
Mm.
was able to get the letter for and see. And it is the document that created Anne Boleyn, is the letters patent that created Anne Boleyn as the Marquess of Pembroke. So
Wow.
right before Henry VIII married her, he created her in her own right. So, usually if you're a duchess, it's because you're married to a duke. The nobility, the title is usually the man's title. But in Anne's case, he creates her, the Marquess of Pembroke, and the letters patent they have in the British Library, the official one that is not just the manuscript, and it's big. It's not just the
Right.
manuscript, but it's an illuminated manuscript. And
Mm.
it includes about the size of my hand. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't take any pictures, so you're just going to have to trust me. But
Right.
it's about the size of my hand, and it is in gold. It is just gorgeous. You see Anne Boleyn's falcon, and of course, that was her emblem, and her falcon begins to show up. But this is the first time I could find that the falcon is crowned. And so Henry was really making a statement when he had this created, certainly to his specifications. So you see her, she's standing on the sort of stump and it's producing all these flowers, and she is standing there holding the staff. And in this case, she, the falcon, is crowned. And that was part of Anne's rise to the top, so that when she went to France to meet Francis I and get his sort of blessing on their marriage, that she would be ennobled in her own right. So that was something so exciting to see, because I'd read about it so many times.
Yeah.
And just to see the way it glimmered and it still shines, and it just really took my breath away. There's something I thought was really funny that I saw at the National Archives, because it showed Queen Jane. And one of the things we know about Lady Jane Grey while she was queen is she sent out a number of letters and instructions and signed them Jane the Queen. So for
Mm.
those days that she was the queen, she took it seriously and she considered herself the queen. And so she signs these patents and these letters, Jane the Queen.
Yeah.
There is one place where they have bound together, which is just so exciting. There's an assignment of a title and a renewal of something for a particular person. And at the top of it, you can see it signed Jane the Queen. And then just a few days later, that same person is appointed to the same position, and it is signed Mary the Queen. Because, of course, when Mary takes the throne, she considers anything Jane had done to be invalid. So she agreed that this person
Right.
should hold this position. So she does want to renew it, but that means that she has to sign it. So it's just really interesting to me. You can see those two signatures just a few days apart, one right after the other, because the crown has changed hands so quickly between
Right.
those two women. And then another thing, and I'll talk about one of them later, but another thing that I just thought was fascinating that I found, in addition to some of the more famous letters of Mary, Queen of Scots, when she's writing in cipher, and some of those we're looking at and we know a little more about, but there's a whole bound collection of other letters from Mary, Queen of Scots, written in cipher, sometimes with the deciphering code or the decoder right there, and sometimes not, but a number of her letters. So you can see that this pattern of her writing to her supporters in this secret writing started long before the Babington and some of those similar plots that had been going on a long time. And I
Right.
thought that was really interesting.
That is very interesting. I know, um it is interesting. It's not quite the same, I don't think. Well, similar, but I really like family history um research. And so for me, being able to see letters or things like that really does help you, I think, connect to your ancestors. But I think it's true of history too, to be able to, learn about these people and what they may have thought, or the way that they would have done something, or maybe what was, between the lines sometimes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Is a really interesting way to, I think, connect with history and to connect with these people. So I think that's really cool that you've been able to see some of these awesome letters and
Yeah.
the patents and all these other really interesting documents to connect with history. Um, so you are actually pretty good at research, I think. I
Well,
feel
thank
like
you.
in our conversations that we have, you're always telling me all these really interesting, fascinating little facts or tidbits about things. And I always am thinking, like, where on earth did you find that? How did you wade through all this stuff and find these things? So, what are some of these interesting things that you found as you've done research for your latest book about Elizabeth I and her suitors?
Well, that has been really fun. And one of the things that I love about that, like you say, is sometimes the document itself, even if you read a transcript, like with the Anne Boleyn being made Marquess of Pembroke, I've read the transcript and I knew what words were included before. But to actually
Um,
see the level of effort and all the gold leaf that had been applied and the way it was decorated really reinforces how important it was and what Henry was doing with that document, the point he was making. So
Right.
there are some similar kinds of things. So I want to show you just a few things to share everybody. And I know this is available to listen to, but if you do have access to YouTube, you may want to take a quick look, because I am going to share some of the places and some of the things that you can see. So I have just a few little images here. This is the newly renovated Folger Shakespeare Library on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Now, if you've been here before, the front, you will notice, looks quite similar, except these steps seem to be leading to somewhere different. And in fact, here is the main entrance now to the library. It's actually underground where it was before. And so the space underneath the library has been opened up, and there are a number of items now that visitors can just walk in and see. There will be all kinds of different kinds of exhibitions going on. So if you get a chance to go to DC, and I'd love to hear from you, we can meet up and go to the Folger together. But it really is great. And one of the things that you can actually see now at the Folger when you walk in is their collection of Shakespeare's First Folio. So this is, from 1623. Now, these primarily have been rebound because the original bindings don't always last. But these are the original pages of 84 First Folios, 1623, the first time Shakespeare's all of his works were bound together, all of his creations, plays, actually, it doesn't include the sonnets, but they were bound together. And without the First Folio, as you've heard me say many times, we would have lost half of Shakespeare's plays. So this is a really important book. And to see this many gathered together at the Folger, and you can just walk in and see them all. I know it's a little bit of an awkward picture because they have a lot of mirrors, so you can see all the sides, and so you see some kind of interesting reflections there. But it is wonderful to be able to see all those First Folios, and those you can just walk in and see right here in Washington, D.C. So here is the British Library, and the exhibition that's up, Elizabeth and Mary, is no longer there. That was my first international trip after COVID. Like the day that England lifted the requirement that if you came in from another country, you had to self-isolate for a week. So as soon as you could just land and hit the ground running, I booked the flight. So I was able to go to this exhibition and see a number of items about Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, that were very helpful for the Tudors by Numbers, my previous book, and for Courting the Virgin Queen, this book. And I wanted to show you just a little bit of what you can see. This is in Elizabeth I's handwriting, some notes she made for a speech she was giving at Parliament. And you can see, it's more of the full speech on the left, but I've zoomed in on the right, that she is continuing to cross things out and add things. And she was angry. And one of the reasons she was angry is Parliament kept telling her to get married and name a successor, which is a big part of the book, Courting the Virgin Queen, because Parliament believed it was their decision and she should just get married because they were telling her to. But if you look at something like this and you see her handwriting and you see her cross things out, and sometimes it looks like she thought, okay, that's going a little too far, I better pull that back. And other times she underlines something she really wants to say. So we don't always know exactly what version she gave, because people are writing down what she says and those records don't always agree. But we do have in this case to Parliament her words, and you can see there sort of in the middle that she talks about this body may not command, and she's telling Parliament they may not command her. The body of Parliament is not going to command her. And you see in the next slide, God forbid that you, and she again is saying, do not do this. So you really see Elizabeth's personality coming through and can almost imagine her crossing things out and writing other things in and being irritated when you see some of her final letters that she writes to people, and her handwriting is so careful. There's a letter to Mary before Elizabeth comes to the throne, and her handwriting is so careful and so measured. And here, it's just all over the place. And so you really do get a sense of her emotions at that time. That's fun. Again, you can read the letter and read the transcript, but seeing it is a little bit different.
Yeah.
Now, I've put up here my little reader's card. It's my old one, so don't think you can just grab my number and use it. But that just shows you, and I wanted to show you, with a little emphasis, our users include academic researchers, undergraduate and postgraduate students, and members of the public. So if you want to, and you can go, this was from the website today. So if you want to go to the British Library and see something in the collection, you can apply for a reader's card, and it has to be renewed every year, but you can do that and see. Now, I do have to mention with the British Library, you may or may not have heard that there was a cyber attack. Other libraries are sort of being warned that when you have so many things digitized, which is fantastic, that does make the collection more reliant on technology. And so there is a lengthy review of the cyber attack, lessons learned, and the library is slowly getting things back online. But if the British Library is your focus for research, I would suggest that you check the day you're planning to be there and make sure that what you want is available, because not everything's available yet. More and more is available all the time, but not all the manuscripts are available even now. So the cyber attack was really dramatic. I think they learned a lot from it and will have a more robust backup system. But it does remind us that there are people taking care of these documents, and that it takes some time. It takes a lot of care. And these libraries really are worthy of our concern and our funding and everything else, because they have our history, our treasures in their collection. So another place, in addition to the British Library, is the National Archives. It's just a little bit outside of London, easily accessible by the tube, by the underground. And there, again, my reader's ticket. This one lasts a little longer. This one is a couple of years, and it'll go into 2025. But it is such a fun place to go, because the building is, it doesn't really look like an archive. It just is this interesting looking building. And there are often swans swimming in the water that come and welcome you. I got to feed the swans one day. Talk about being in the right place at the right time. I had just finished some research and was just getting a little fresh air, going for a walk around the grounds. And the swan feeder came up and said, "Hey, do you want to feed the swans?" It was so fun. So you go inside, and here is that element I was talking about, or that item I was talking about. You can see Jane the Queen and her signature. You can see her scribe has a particular hand, and you can read Edward Bernard, and he was the one who was getting the position. Then right next to it, Mary the Queen. Her scribe has a different hand, although it is this, the same words. There is the name again, Edward Bernard. And so it is the same person being appointed, but Mary signed it herself as a way, again, of discounting Jane ever really being queen. I just thought that was such a great little detail to give us a glimpse into Mary's thinking. Don't you think?
I do. It's really interesting.
Yeah. So here's Mary saying, well, this is no good. And some of the documents, you can see where it says Jane the Queen, and someone in Mary's government has written not Jane, not the Queen.
Not the Queen.
So that's kind of a reminder, no matter how much power you have in a moment, later
can always be taken away or changed.
or changed. So I thought that was kind of funny. But these two, just these tiny pieces are so interesting to me. Now, you asked about specifically courting the Virgin Queen, and this was
Yeah.
one of my favorite finds. This is a collection of letters, and it says right there, there's this marvelous engraving in the beginning of it, the complete, spelled not the way we spell complete, ambassador. The ambassador refers to Francis Walsingham. And then it's the letters of negotiation of Francis Walsingham and the answers of Lord Burleigh and the Earl of Leicester and Thomas Smith and others. This is basically a history of the
Hmm.
letters that Walsingham was writing to Burleigh back and forth and others in Elizabeth's government while Walsingham was in France as negotiations were going on. And I'll show you, it says more here when it talks about the reader. Collection is a negotiation of Francis Walsingham during his 3 years residence as ambassador in that mysterious treaty of Queen Elizabeth's marriage successively with the two great brothers of Valois. So this is during the 1570s when Catherine de' Medici wants Elizabeth to first marry her son Henri, and that doesn't last too long. That negotiation kind of falls apart quickly. And then the second brother is her son Hercule Francois, who becomes known as Elizabeth's frog. And
Oh.
so this is Walsingham and Burleigh, William Cecil, and Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who of course is weighing in over the 1570s. You see Dudley objecting to the marriage. Of course, in 1575, he has his great final proposal during the progress at Kenilworth. And so he certainly doesn't want anything to work out with France. You see William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, taking a really pragmatic approach that even though this is a foreign marriage, this would be good for England. And you see Walsingham's response in 1572 to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Protestants were killed, or Huguenots. And Walsingham was in Paris at the time and sort of saw it happening right outside his ambassador's house right there. And he becomes determined that the queen not marry someone from France and absolutely not marry a Catholic. So you see this, and this is just a few, this is just a couple from the table of contents, which is just a list of the letters. And all of these letters are included, including some from Walsingham to Cecil or Burleigh to Walsingham, the queen here too, the queen to Sir Francis Walsingham. And sometimes they write to her. And it's just this marvelous collection that you could spend days just reading
Oh,
through.
absolutely.
And see, these are her top governing people. This is the center of her council. And they are spending hours and hours and days and weeks and months and years working on her marriage. I find that really interesting. And it goes through the
Yeah.
1570s. And although that is certainly, she is in her 40s during this time. Now, we know today a lot of people are able to have children in their 40s, but in Elizabeth's time, that wasn't always the case. And we don't have a lot of records of women having children at that time, at that age. And so it's really interesting to see them negotiating for that. So I just thought I wanted to share just a few of those things that I was able to see and able to work with, and that gave me a little window into, of course, we don't know what people were feeling or thinking at the time,
Right.
but we get a little sense of what they're doing, whether they're scribbling something out or these letters flying back and forth. You're spending all this time writing to the ambassador from France, but what are you writing about? The Queen's marriage. So it
Right.
really does give us an interesting view into what's going on during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that is funny to see her like scribbling out, like you said. I think it shows her personality and So that is really interesting and fascinating to think about. So we'll just ask one final question. So I do think, like I said before, I think you're really good at research because you obviously find all these really amazing little tidbits and pieces and things. But do you enjoy it? And why or why not, maybe?
I really do enjoy the research. And one of the things is because I do feel like I can almost get to know somebody, or I can
Mhm.
maybe get to know them a little better, or I can really imagine what they're doing, what it meant to see a letter where she scribbled something out because she wants to say something even harsher. And then maybe someone has said, ooh, that's a little much. And so she writes something else that's a little less, or to
Yeah.
see some of these letters. One of the things that was also fun to see is the letter that Elizabeth had written to her sister Mary. It's called the Tide Letter because it's after Mary has said she has to go to the Tower for possible involvement in the Wyatt Rebellion. And Elizabeth writes the letter to Mary, protesting her innocence, promising she is a faithful servant of her sister, the Queen, and then signs off. She doesn't have any more to say, but she writes lines all the way through the rest of the
Mm,
piece of paper so no one can forge her handwriting and add a PS that could get her
right.
into trouble. So seeing these documents, I think, really brings you close to them. Another thing I think is really interesting is, and I was fortunate to attend a history workshop with Professor Susanna Lipscomb a few weeks ago. And she talked to us about how, as a historian, it's really important to approach the document with an open mind rather than having already made up your mind and looking for proof of that, but to approach it with an open mind and see what conclusions you can draw. And it's a good reminder to all of us to try and accept these as they were. So if I see something that Jane the Queen has signed as Jane the Queen, I can think, okay, here's this woman. We know she was 16 or 17 years old. We know she had not been set out to be queen. And I think there have been some assumptions that she was so reluctant. She didn't want anything to do with it because of her age. She never wanted to be queen. And even after she became queen, she never wanted it and just resisted it the whole time.
Yeah.
But for me, seeing something that she wrote in her hand, Jane the Queen, doing government business, tells me there was something else going on as well. That she was somebody who was taking that seriously, who was getting down to business, who was writing to the nobility, who was appointing people to positions. Even in those few days, she didn't know they would be few days, but even right off the bat,
Mhm.
when she knew there were protests going on, she was doing the government business that she needed to be doing. That is something I was really excited to learn about her. And I went to it
Right.
with an open mind or tried to see it with an open mind, not saying, okay, I'm looking for evidence she never wanted to be queen. Because I think there's
Right.
some evidence that once she got there, she took it seriously. So that's one of the things I really enjoy about these documents and these elements, just seeing what you didn't know and the new questions that you can ask. So that's one of the reasons I love
Yeah.
it so much. And of
That's
course, as you know, any reason to go to England is a good reason. So put me on a plane for research. I'm
exactly.
a girl.
Sign me up.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I love it. Well, I appreciate your answering these questions. I think it's really fascinating to learn the process behind the book and what goes into uh creating this either a work of nonfiction or fiction,
Hmm.
all the things you have to do and learn. So I appreciate you sharing that process.
Thank you. Thank you. And we do want to offer to anyone, we know that you may have other questions about research or things that I've mentioned or anything else. Please feel free to reach out either to me or via comments on the podcast, however you like to do it, on the website, however. If you have other questions about research or about some of the things that I've mentioned, the British Library, the archives, or the Folger, I know there are lots of other places. Those are just the three that I use most often. So thank you, Lindsey, for joining me in this conversation. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We hope your summer's going really well, and we really appreciate you spending it, or some of it, with the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics, exploring how history shows us what's possible. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. And may I please ask a favor? Our reviews are sort of down for the last 6 months in terms of numbers. So if you have the time, would you please, if you're enjoying the show, leave a review of the podcast, leave a review on YouTube. It is so helpful for people who are looking for us. It helps people find us, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us and for supporting us as we learn how history shows us what's possible.